I feel like people can potentially be surprised on the night.
Yo, guys, what is everybody saying? Quite a surprising result last night in regard to the Deji versus Vinnie Hacker fight, but I think I can safely say that I'm one of the least surprised out there. I had made a video on this fight prior to it kicking off, like at least a month prior to the fight. And of course, I didn't exactly predict Vinnie Hacker to win or anything like that, but I did make note of how it didn't really make sense to me, the constant underestimation of Vinnie Hacker for no apparent reason other than the fact that he's a TikToker mainly. That seemed to be like people's only justification. Beyond that, people really didn't even know who Vinnie Hacker was, much, where that kind of just startled me even more. Like, how are you so confident to underestimate someone that you do not know much about?
Having this much like critique when you don't know the opponent well, doesn't really make much sense. Why you shouldn't dismiss them, because you literally don't know much about them. And all these little things that seem to be contributing to the factors of people's opinions, they aren't really too sensible.
I had made that video towards the end of March, and that's when there was kind of the height of all of this talk down on Vinnie Hacker, and assuming that Deji had already won, as the fight was kind of just recently announced around that time. But that talk didn't stop. It very much continued and has been a continuous theme throughout. Vinnie Hacker has been the underdog severely. Even at the press conference, FouseyTube had called out Deji, saying, you're kind of hyping up this return, and your return doesn't really mean much. If you come back and beat Vinnie Hacker, would that even mean anything?
You really think you beating Vinnie Hacker on a return fight shocks the world?
And it's not even like Deji gave him the craziest credit in the world. Deji referred to Vinnie as just a stepping stone back then.
This is just, no offense to Vinnie, this is just a stepping stone.
Even the Bread Batch, if you guys are familiar with a page on Instagram that covers a lot of YouTube news and general updates, he's a page that remains very impartial majority of the time, but he even had a few sarcastic lines about Vinnie Hacker, in a caption saying, "Tomorrow we see, one of the best to grace the ring," and jokingly called him the best ever.
We got an action-packed card with names like Bryce Hall, TBE, Vinnie Hacker, and more.
So yeah, that narrative just never left, but from the get-go I could see that people could easily be making a mistake here, mainly just because there wasn't much justification for the underestimation. I already covered how I was simply saying that people might just be surprised by the result, even if Deji still wins, because people were talking like if Deji doesn't win first round, they might be shocked, let alone a Deji loss.
That even if Deji wins this fight, it's not as easy as a win as they think. People are literally saying first round win, Nate Robinson, this and that, where if Deji was to win on decision, that sounds like, that would blow people's minds. So pretty much that wouldn't necessarily blow my mind.
But yeah, so the actual fight commences now, and a surprising result for the masses is Deji is TKO'd in the third round. In the beginning of the third round is where he had taken a knee, and it seemed like there may be something wrong, but it was clearly his cardio that seemed to be gone. He seemed to be almost dead on his feet, and when he received his standing 8 count in that round, you could see from how he was breathing that his cardio was just non-existent. His cardio even looked questionable during the fight a bit to me. I think he was edging the fight, and even with the final punch stats, with all the punches that he conceded when he just wasn't defending himself, or wasn't throwing back, I should say, he still just about, I think, won in terms of like more punches landed. But I think his cardio was affecting him in the first 2 rounds. He wasn't really following up on these big left hands that he was able to land successfully, where it was looking like even if he does win this, it still wouldn't be in the cleanest fashion that everyone seemed to think was so guaranteed. But yeah, in the end, he ended up losing by TKO in the third round. And fair play, is not as if he lost because of Vinnie Hacker's brilliance. He more so lost because of lacking that fault of his own, But that was even again something that I was highlighting. I was raising the point that I'd raised the point previously that people are not mentioning that Deji will win because Deji's gonna do this, or Deji's improved, or Deji's in tip-top shape. I was literally saying that before. Like, no one is saying Deji's gonna win because of his own merits, or because of his own work. You know, people are acting like all Deji has to do is show up, doesn't even have to train, he can just win. People don't seem to think like Deji's gonna win this off Deji's ability. No one's really saying stuff like, yeah, Deji's improved over the years. So I've heard he's been training since, where I think Deji, he's just in tip-top shape where he's gonna defeat this guy. You know, almost all the comments are saying Deji's gonna clean this guy up because of who the opponent is. But yeah, that evidently wasn't the case, you know, unfortunately for Deji. And, you know, it was a bit, you know, ironic because when he had faced Jake Paul in 2018, what was heavily discussed was his training there, and his work ethic for that fight, you know, was highly scrutinized, and people said he didn't train well while he was living in the Sidemen house. You know, that was kind of heavily discussed, where it seemed like he didn't put appropriate training in at that point in time, where, you know, if anything, you would expect for his trainer levels to go up since then. But it almost seems like his trainer levels got worse in a few aspects. Number one being that, you know, he fought a lesser opponent yesterday, and, you know, obviously he didn't go as far. Then when he fought Jake Paul, he was in better shape, you know, better physical shape than he was yesterday, and he would even be more arguably excused for being in worse shape against Jake Paul, because for the Jake Paul fight he had to be heavier because of matching up to Jake Paul's weight, where if there was any time to be a bit, you know, quote unquote more out of shape or just heavier, it would have been back then. But it's now that he was in, you know, his physique was a bit in worse condition, and clearly his cardio was in worse condition, where, you know, gives a question mark on whether Deji was also thinking how a lot of the viewers were thinking, where he's just thinking, you know, this is a guaranteed done deal, and that, you know, he's got this in the bag because, you know, the training elements and preparation seem to be lacking. Going forward for Deji, you know, with all of that being said, I don't know what would be next. This is a thought that I kind of already had just while watching the fight. You know, after the Jake Paul fight, he had some kind of words that were a bit negative, you know, saying he let people down and, you know, talking a bit negatively. And in this fight, he had some similar words. This is something that not a lot of people may have caught, because there was quite a lot of noise going on. But while Vinnie Hacker goes to him, you can hear Deji, if you listen closely, saying that he's a failure.
From these two now.
Plenty of respect after that. And we talk about leveling up, or I talk about leveling up. I'm talking about, you know, clout, numbers, more fans. Vinnie Hacker just did this in front of a completely different audience, and I think he's got a lot of new fans tonight. That was
where that kind of negative attitude, and also losing a fight, you know, kind of quite clearly off your own fault, you know, with the lack of cardio, and losing a fight that everyone had anticipated you to win, you know, it kind of got me thinking, and I was thinking, I think Deji might be done. I think Deji might be done. I don't think we might see Deji box again. You know, it took him 2 years to return to the ring, and even after those 2 years, he returned to a far, far lesser opponent than Jake, what he had before, where, you know, now I just don't know if I can picture him coming back, especially with what seemed like the negative mindset that he had in the ring. Vidal, interestingly, I also just saw this today, has kind of made comments to suggest that he shouldn't return, kind of going a bit off of what I said. Like, he seems to be consistently not putting enough work in to get the job, where Vidal's tweet implies, you know, if you just can't put that work rate in, then there just isn't too much of a point, which, you know, I guess one can see where he's coming from. But I think a lot of Deji's viewers would hope that, you know, Deji can eventually just knuckle down and put the appropriate work in, and get some redemption out there. Speaking of redemption, Anissa and Gibb was absolutely robbed. Daylight robbery, you know, it's quite, you know, it's very, very, very unfortunate to see. Extremely, you know, it's crazy. I was just watching the fight back because I was just thinking, this can't be real. Anise and Gibb, I feel, won all 5 rounds, and then the scorecards just don't make sense. Like literally, every judge scored someone winning.
Lorenzo Hunt scored the contest 49-46. Coach Chuck scored the contest 49-46. And Keon Wilson scored the contest 50-46.
Where these are all in favor of someone. Not one person called it a draw, but somehow it's a majority draw. When if every judge gave the fight to someone, then that should mean someone winning by split decision, 2-1, or someone winning by unanimous decision. Even Michael Buffer, you can see his tweet. He put his comments out there. It just doesn't make it, like literally, there's people say robbery when it's an opinionated situation and subjective, but this isn't even subjective. Like literally, unless I'm missing something. There's a lot of conspiracy theory a bit going on social media. They had ended up, the people throwing it had ended up tweeting that Taylor won. when the scores were announced or just about to be announced. Where, I don't know. But yeah, that's about it. I just kind of want to recap that because, like I said again, this is something that I had anticipated all the way from back in March when I just saw people's initial reaction to Deji returning to the ring against Vinnie Hacker. I knew that it may not be plain sailing, and I certainly wasn't in the mindset that a lot of people seem to be in, where, like I say, this comes as a major shock. People are out there thinking, this is one of the craziest upsets. But, I personally think, people should have never just even been thinking how they were thinking in the first place. Anytime that I spot something in these fights that I think is, worthy of mentioning, I always like to highlight it. Back with KSI Logan 1 that happened in Manchester, as soon as I saw that on the contracts it said this was a 2-event fight, I started calling it that, they might make this fight a draw or something, to make the narrative of the second fight make sense. And, that also ended up being what happened so yeah, I always try to share the information if I feel like I'm onto something, on any of these topics. But yeah, like the video, share, and subscribe.
I'll give you 1 or 2 years, you'll be irrelevant, and your fat mum will be craving